So before we get started, I have a little bit of a disclaimer that you're either going to find a tremendous relief or a tremendous disappointment. I am not going to teach you code today. I am not going to teach you algorithms. I am not going to teach you how to create artificial intelligence in the deep sense. So now I'm going to wait, and if you'd like to leave and find another subject, you can go.
Well, entice us with what you're...
Okay. So what we are going to talk about today is we're going to talk about the trends about AI, and we're going to talk about the business case for AI. Okay, so a little bit of background, a little bit of information on me, and give you a sort of point of view how we're coming to this. My name is Drexler. I'm the CEO and chief strategist at a company in Pittsburgh called Campos. We are an organization that does customer experience and brand planning work that requires a lot of forward-thinking trends work. Where are our clients who come to us are wondering, where are we going in the future and how are we getting there? So using information that has existed historically and then trying to project into the future. Okay, so a lot of the trends work that we do really has to do with how our businesses and how our organizations going to be navigating into the future, and how does that need to happen in any given industry. So that is what we're going to talk about today. Everybody interested? Okay. Who all, raise your hand if you have a component of AI happening anywhere in your business right now. Come on. By the end, I bet you come up with a few. So once we really get our heads around what AI is, maybe we'll be able to get there. But the bottom line for me is that organizations come to us to do this because they need to think differently. And the importance of thinking differently is going to become exponentially important as time goes on in the next several years. So let's dive in. So our company started monitoring and sort of engaging with the AI trend around the time that AI started to come out of science fiction land. And it was really helped by IBM Watson. Doing this Jeopardy thing was like, okay, so artificial intelligence, which was Jetson land, right? Like we could see that. How does it get from there to here, where we actually can sort of put some structure around it? So IBM Watson was important in that way, right? It was natural language processing. It started as a component that we're going to talk about. But because of that, it made sense. Questions were answered, questions were asked, questions were answered. We could see, sort of tangibly something that was happening. And we also started to get a sense at that same time, hi, come on in, about machine learning. Like around that same time, everybody was starting to get, in any business in the United States that you would go into, they would say, yeah, we have a ton of data. We're not doing anything with it. So there was this sense that we have a ton of data, something should be happening with it. And then the market was starting to say, there's this thing called machine learning that can take all of that data and can create algorithms and can learn from it and can change your business. So very quickly, over this period of time, things started to happen. At the end of 2016 and 2017, we did in one of our trends report, we called it AI for President. I don't know if you know this, but Watson actually had a Watson for President whole Facebook page set up at the end of the last election. And this became a really interesting thing because the idea of acceptance for AI and confidence in AI was something that we started to look at, sort of compared to how people felt confident in our government. So at the end of the election, at the end of 2016, confidence in our government was at 19%, right? And confidence among users, sort of more pioneering users, so 7,000 users of artificial intelligence, for AI to run our company, AI as president, was 20%. So people who had engaged with AI had as much confidence in AI as people had in our government. And since then, our government confidence level has gone down to 17%, but the confidence that people have in AI has exploded. So these are things now that you see in your house or somebody else's house, or you see in your business. All of these AI tools that even 2 years ago were like still a little bit science fiction, you now see. So there was an article published by MIT in November, this past November, that was bemoaning the fact that there was only there was 41% of people who didn't trust these, right? That means that there were almost 60% of people who did trust these. And yet only 17% of people trust our government, right? So we're seeing this pretty rapid change in people's trust all around the subject of artificial intelligence.
Weren't those things proven to be stealing information from, like, stealing information? Amazon wasn't. I don't follow the news too much, but I did hear something about that.
About what?
About the Alexis, like, stealing information on some level.
There's a couple of things about sort of where AI sits in the confidence scheme, right? There's a reason why 40% of people don't trust it, right? So there's those kinds of things. There's stories that are coming out, about AI in lots of different sort of ways. And that's going to continue to happen, as something becomes new. In the same way, maybe that we would draw that connection. In the same way, people tell lots of stories about government that are true or not true, right? So there's a lot of anxiety that gets created when you start talking about AI. But what we're going to talk about today is really the business case for AI, not the political case for AI. So you can't read that up there, but what that says is cognitive technologies. I want to just give you, before we go forward, I'm going to go back a little bit just so that you know what we're talking about when we say AI. So cognitive technologies is sort of that umbrella term that goes over a lot of different types of technology that collectively are artificial intelligence. So I want to walk you through, just step by step so you can understand which ones we're doing. Essentially, over the course of these, they get one to the next a little bit more autonomous, okay? And so we're going to talk about that. But the first one is machine learning. So again, this is that sort of accessible idea of there's a lot of information out there. I'm capturing a lot of information. What can I do with it? And can I begin to predict? So it's machine learning when things like when you're shopping online and you get pop-ups that say, maybe you'd like this, right? Machine learning. Learning from your behaviors in the past with that organization that give them really good clues that you only buy black dresses, right? Or you only buy fishing rods that look like this, or whatever, however that works, right? Also, targeting ads. When you wonder how particular ads get targeted from when you're Google searching or when you're doing any sort of shopping, the ads that are being thrown at you are machine learning, observing your behaviors in the past and then feeding you things that matter to you. Now, we don't like that necessarily when other people are doing it to us. Some of us do. I actually like the curating in Nordstrom that I don't have to look at every dress because they're going to give me 5 that are probably the ones I'm going to like. But in our businesses, when we start to think about that same capability, that if we're not doing that in our business and somebody else is doing that sort of targeting of our customer, what does that mean for us from a business perspective? All right, so the next one that we're just going to, again, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, is robotic RPA, robotic process automation. I actually don't like the word robotic in this one because what it does for business people is it makes it sound like it's something that's way too hard for us to do. It makes it sound like because it's robotic, it's out of our realm. But the way that I would ask you to think about this particular technology is, and I'll give you an example. So you change your address and you call the bank to tell the bank that you changed your address. Now, within that bank, you might have insurance policies, and you have checking accounts, and you might have a savings account over here. You have a lot of different places within that bank. In an old world way, some human being in that bank would go to all your accounts and make sure that they were changed, right? In a new world way, all of those things, all of those different sources are linked to you, and making that one change can make that change everywhere, right? So when you think about robotics, it's just making all those things happen without having to tell it to, right? Because you've set it up and you've taught it to do that. We'll talk some more about that as we go on. The next one, neural networks and deep learning, is really about taking that next step to understand how the human brain works and to try to make these technologies work as close to human functioning as we can. In your first talk today, you heard a thing about customer experience. And again, that's what our company does. The idea of trying to figure out how people are going to behave, how you want them to behave and where those things come together. You have to anticipate that from a human perspective, right? Because that's how we behave. We behave like humans. Okay. All of these things have the capacity to recognize patterns and deal with data at a level we just can't. Humans can't consume at that speed and at that level. And then the last one is natural language processing. So that's what Watson was, natural language processing. The capacity to hear somebody ask a question, to go through the archive and come up with an answer. They have to understand the language in order to answer the question. So those 4 basic capabilities are what sort of combine into what we think about as AI, the cognitive technologies. But the reality is, because we're not technologists, is anybody a technologist? All right, well, the consulting firms would say you're all technologists and that all your businesses are technology businesses because that's where we're going. But nevertheless, because we're not that and we're business people, we're going to think about how AI intersects with the business needs that we have today and where our businesses have to go in order to respond to a market where AI is driving it. Okay, so there's 3 areas that we're going to talk about. The first one is automating our business processes. So this is back-end stuff, and this is the efficiency and money-saving stuff, right? These are the things that happen inside companies that generate savings. The second one is insight into our customers. How do we get that insight? How do we use that insight? And then the last one is how do we actually use that insight to drive experience, to change experience, to make our product interact with human beings. All right, so we're going to talk through each of those 3 levels. First one, I put this sweet little face on purpose because the idea of the humanizing of this whole category of process automation is problematic. It's problematic because I think it scares a lot of people away from even trying because it's a robot. Robot is code. That's all it is. Robot is a human being that wrote a code to make something do something. And that can happen in the back end of any business, right? There can be code written to say, if somebody calls in with a change of their address, it goes here, it goes here, it goes here, it goes here. It's code. We put a face on it because it started out like science fiction, and it looked like the Jetsons, and it was doing this thing. But the reality is that degree of processing is the next generation of what businesses have been doing for some time. So things to keep in mind with this. This is the least expensive. It has the fanciest face, typically, because it has a robot face. But it's the least expensive AI capability to access. It's the easiest to implement. It's actually the least smart. The Harvard Business Review did a story on this and said 50% of the companies that they engaged with who are doing something in AI are doing this. This is the most common. So process automation, back-end stuff. Okay, the next one is cognitive insight. So I'm just going to give you an example. We got all the data for a restaurant chain, actually a restaurant organization that had multiple restaurants in a chain. And underneath each of those restaurants, there were many locations. And underneath many of those locations, we had credit card sales data. So a lot of data. We took all of the households of that data and we appended a code. There's a code now attached to every household in the United States that tells you sort of all of the socioeconomic factors in that house that you would ever want to know. Not just are they beer or wine drinkers, but what kind of beer. 66,000 purchasing behaviors. All that data is available. So we attach that code. We use a license for IBM Watson, which I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. And in an old world, 2 months ago, maybe 2 years ago, we would have asked questions of the data ourselves. We would have said, okay, what's the difference between this restaurant in terms of revenue, this restaurant chain, and this one? Within this restaurant chain, how are each of the different restaurants producing differently? We would have asked questions like that, right? That's how we do it. And it would take a long time, and we would keep doing it. So with this, we said to Watson, literally these words, what's the deal with lunch? That was it. And what we got back was, these kind of people go to this place for lunch, these kind of people go to this place, these kind of people go to this place. Now, within this place, these kind of people spend this much, these kind of people spend this much, and all of the story of lunch sort of appeared. The capacity to do that, for us to do a lunch analysis on our own, that would have been a month or 6 weeks worth of work. This was, what's the story with lunch? Now, we had to get the data in there, and you had to trust the data, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But what's the story with lunch, right? That's what we're talking about. Going from that manual world, that's that one step deeper in terms of insight. Now, ultimately, what that does is it leads us to predictive, right? So if we know that these people are the people that go to that restaurant chain, we're not going to waste our advertising dollars over here on them, right? We're going to start moving our advertising dollars over here. And once we do that, now we can start to predict what kind of return we're going to get on those people. So it all is moving towards that sort of predictive stuff. And then we've got cognitive engagement. So when we say engagement, really what we're just talking about are like chat bots. Those 24/7, I can talk to somebody and they can answer my question. Of those two things, so remember I said at the beginning, 50% of people were doing process automation, 38% of people using AI for insights, and the balance here. This is actually the least of the activity that's happening, although sometimes you feel like it's the most because you're presented with a chat bot. You see that sort of actively happening. The analytics stuff is happening in the back end, and the process automation is happening in the way back end. But what you see are the bots, right? And so sometimes you presume that's what AI is. And so we're starting here by saying that it's not. One thing to keep in mind, what I said was the process automation saves money for companies. The insights and the experience are the things that make money for companies, right? The whole process of AI started with saving money by process automation. But where it's going is, how can we drive more revenue? How can we do more sales based on insights and based on experience? Okay. But why are we talking about this today, and why do we even care? Does anybody know the year that Steve Jobs announced this particular item? 7, close. And does anybody know the year the first app appeared?
2009.
Yeah, it's end of 8 into 9, right? Okay, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I'm sure I said to my son, what's an app? I am certain that conversation happened at some point in time, right? 10 years later, I have dozens of them in my hand all the time. Like, does anybody go anywhere without an app now? Like, everything on your phone is an app, right? So the idea that we have this enormous velocity of change to deal with is something that, I don't care what kind of business you have, you can't avoid that. The velocity of change is happening in such a way that our businesses are at risk. And so we need to pay attention. Has anybody seen this before, the corporate life cycle? This is, if you were in business school, in the dark ages, 5 years ago, you would see this. And this is Adiz's corporate life cycle. I highly recommend this book. It's an awesome look at sort of the trajectory of business. It talks about like the startup business on the left-hand side, going from courtship to infancy, and all that like noise that's happening in the mess of a startup. And the things that are on the inside are the things that can lead to premature death. But left to its own devices, a company, any company, I don't care what company you're talking about, is going to take that curve, right? How long do you think is the lifespan historically in the United States? How long do you think the lifespan of a business has been?
25 years.
Historically? Do you know any businesses that are older than 25 years?
Oh, yeah.
Like what?
Sheets.
Yep.
Our bank is 130 years old this year.
There you go.
6 generations.
There you go. And Ford, and I mean, you can think of a lot of brands that are older than 25 years. We're going to come back to that in a minute. Okay, if you don't care about anything that we have to say in this session today, this is the one thing I want you to take away. So let's just pay attention for a minute. This is how they're teaching this in business school now. This is the innovation curve. So the beginning of that, you can see that little dip that happens. As new innovation or technologies are kind of figured out, that dip means we're not making any money. This line right here is money. We're not making any money. We're figuring out something new. We're figuring out a way to do something differently. You exploit that, and a technology will grow, right? But what this says is that if that's all you do, you are going to go down the other side of that curve. It's not quite as steep, but you are, in fact, going to go down the other side of that curve. So what has to happen is that you have to create a new hook. So each time your business gets to, oh, we're good, it's time to create another hook. You have to keep recreating that business. And the way that the thing that's driving that is technology, right? So getting to the point where it's like, oh, good, we're smooth sailing. No. Smooth sailing is the time to be able to say, okay, of all these things we do, of the things we produce, of the way that we look at this, what has the opportunity for reinvention? Where is the innovation opportunity here? And the reason that they're teaching this is this. In 1960, the average span of a business in the United States was 60 years. The average business lasted 60 years. How many generations is 60 years? It's at least 3, right? Maybe 4. So you can have a bank that's been around through multiple generations. In 25 years, can you pass on a business? Like, what happens? If businesses are and they're going down, and literally, they're going down the other side of this for the last 5 of those 25 years, right? So how do you do that? How do you make sure that this doesn't happen? You know, and how do you plan, if the world is going in this direction, how do you plan for something new? And this is the answer to that. You have to always be looking at what the next innovation is, because technology is taking us there. Okay, so why don't we do that? Why don't we do that? Why aren't we today saying, oh, this is super simple. I know how AI works. I'm going to apply that to this part of my business, and I'm going to create a whole new thing. Why aren't we doing that? Because it's hard. Because it's hard.
Constantly changing too. It's always updating. It's always becoming newer. It's always.
Yep. And it's super easy to say, you know what? It's always changing, so therefore I'm not going to learn it today because I'd have to relearn it tomorrow, right? Like that's. But I mean, I'm here to tell you that can't be the answer. So we're going to find a different one. Mm-hmm.
Also because we don't know how the market would react.
Yeah, I think not. No, I mean, the idea of looking forward, I mean, your innovation implies risk, right? So you're stepping outside of the comfort zone, which you guys talked a lot about in the first session this morning, and imagining a future possibility, and then you're marching towards it. It could change. All of that is true. But I'm going to propose that the biggest thing that holds people back from any sort of engagement with AI is this. Now, there are definitely some people in this room who maybe have never seen one of these. Gentlemen?
Floppy disk.
Well, actually, I think the floppy disk was the one before this, which was literally floppy. This issue of data management is the #1 thing that's holding people back from being able to engage with artificial intelligence in its simplest forms. Every single person in this room has the capacity to do some form of artificial intelligence, and we're going to get to that. But the problem is data. Almost every client that we engage with, because all of our process starts with data, and almost everyone says, oh, my data's a mess. Okay, you know, so sometimes what we're doing with those organizations is we're manually pulling data sets together so that we can do analysis with them. You know, but ultimately, within those organizations, data has to get cleaned up. So if there's 2 things that you take away from today, the innovation hook is one of them, and the other is go home and love your data, right? Because ultimately, in order to do any of the rest of this, you have to trust your data. So what has to happen in order for you to trust somebody? You have to have a relationship with them. So you need to have a relationship with your data. You really need to get in there and say, what do we have? What are we collecting? How are we collecting it? How, you know, just know what the data is and plan for that data. So data management is the first thing that holds people back. The other thing that holds people back, again, you know, and I think that one is survivable. Like, that one is manageable. You can make that happen. Training algorithms. So everybody freaks out when they hear about training algorithms, right? But the reality is, if you think about it this way, you're teaching a computer to do something over and over and over and over again. So let's just imagine the same way you would teach an employee. And we'll use this example a couple times as we go through. So somebody calls into a bank and says, I'm changing my name and my address, right? So they have a lot of relationships with that bank. They've got some insurance over here, and they've got some savings accounts, and they've got all kinds of places that they exist. In the old days, somebody in the back room would take the call, and they would go to each one of their files and would just fix that, right? And that would happen. Now, all that has to happen is they tell the computer once, change this address, and it goes zip, 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 and changes that. And we just expect that to happen, right? So one of the things that has to happen that holds people back is that we just need enough data to teach our computers to do things like that, and actually at a more advanced level. But we need enough data to do that. We're going to talk about how you get access to that in a minute. The other thing are ethical concerns, and this is what you raised too. So there was a big thing on the news a couple of weeks ago about, I don't know if it was Alexa or which one it was, capturing children's conversations. Who owns children's conversations? Do parents own children's conversations? Did they have a right to record those children's conversations? That's a whole ethical thing, and that's not going anywhere. We're going to be having ethical conversations about artificial intelligence for the next 20 years while we get deeper into the space. The next one is talent acquisition. And then we are going to talk about job issues at the very end of this. The reality is, unless you are the top tier sort of provider, organization in the country, you're probably not going to have a data scientist on your staff who can do all this stuff. So what it requires is that we start to think differently about what our workforce looks like. There needs to be an ecosystem of people who can do certain things. And they probably do them for a lot of different people. So we've got freelance, gig sort of economy that's building around doing this kind of work. Some people are even crowdsourcing to train algorithms. So there's a different way we have to think. It doesn't have to be everybody is sort of a butt in the chair. One thing we know for sure, and I can give you these stats, the average job growth that's expected from 2016 to 2026 is 5.5%. So the average job will grow, the demand will grow about 5.5%. The demand for statisticians is going to grow 34%. The demand for software application developers, 27%. And information security analysts that's 27%. It's 29% for software developers. So 5 times the magnitude of your average job. So if you haven't decided what you're going to do in your next life, that might be one thing that you want to do. Talent acquisition is a barrier. The last barrier is cultural change. This is hard. It's hard to get up and talk to your legacy employees and your company about these sorts of changes because of all those things we just talked about, and because it requires changing skill sets within organizations. But the reality is, unless you want to go down the other side of that curve, it has to happen, because it's going to move beyond you, and you're going to be left behind if you don't take the time to do it. Okay? All right, so let's talk about moving forward. What would need to happen? Let's just imagine that everybody's gotten to the point where they say, yes, we need to find how to integrate artificial intelligence for competitive advantage in our company. What do we need to do? All right, I'm going to talk about a couple of things. There's a sequence to how artificial intelligence is developed. And I'm going to use this, and hopefully this will stay in your brain better than the sequence. The sequence is assisted intelligence, augmented intelligence, and then autonomous intelligence. But this is how it works. So I have a BMW G5. No, X5. GX, whatever. It's a car. Nice car. I like it. It has the same thing that all of your cars has. It has cruise control. Assisted intelligence. Okay? Took the car in for service last month. I don't remember. Something had to happen, and they gave me a loaner. And I'm driving out. I'm actually on the turnpike, driving along, and all of a sudden, I'm doing this. Because the lane sensors are on. Augmented intelligence, right? I didn't ask it to do that. I didn't actually set the control. Like even on your cruise control, okay, 72, okay, 69, right? You're setting it, you're controlling it. These sensors are not asking you if it's okay. They have learned this behavior, and they're doing it for you, right? The next level of automation. And then autonomous. I live in Pittsburgh, where you can get into an autonomous Uber, and they'll take your picture and you can post it on Facebook. Now, right now they have 2 software engineers sitting in the front seat. So it's not actually an autonomous car, because they can override at any time. And they have to override because these cars actually follow the rules. And nobody in Pittsburgh actually does that. But think about those 3 steps. So where are you, in the business in terms of doing those 3 steps? And can you start with an assisted technology, and sort of move across? Okay. So let's imagine that we're going to take this journey. We've got to think about sort of how exactly are we going to get there? What are the ways that people do this? It seems like a big black box. Like this happens over there, but I'm not quite sure sort of how that happens. Do we send little gremlins into our system and they figure it out? Like, how does this happen? Okay. All of the consulting organizations and the tech firms are telling us that like 3 things. There's 3 ways that you can or will be able to access in the next couple of years, really high-level artificial intelligence that you can apply to your business. This one is the most difficult to imagine right now, because it's talking about the whole platform that we start to work on, the whole operating systems that we work with now. And do you remember when they changed the operating platforms? Some of you do. The first time or the second time back when it was like a huge issue to do that. Apple changes them now a couple of times a year and you hardly notice. But in those first years, it was really difficult. Well, once we move to a platform that is based on artificial intelligence, we'll have access to all the data that we need and the capacity to get to all of our data. This hasn't happened yet, but there's like a gold rush going on for, is that what's going to happen? Is our next just the regular platform that we use in everyday life, is it going to be driven by artificial intelligence? But you don't have to wait to find that out. This you can do right now. So for free, you can go online and you can get a license that connects you to IBM Watson for free, as long as you have 256 megabytes or smaller of a data set that you want to analyze, and you can play with it today. You can do it when you go home, right? Now, we didn't use the free one. We have a license, but that's the technology that we use to say, what about lunch, right? It's something that you can get a data set that you have access to. You can connect with it, and you can just start to explore. But it's available. So this idea of vendor-led is something that's actually happening. So Salesforce has a thing called Einstein that's being built into its capacity. SAP and Oracle, who do the big enterprise systems, it's being built into those systems. So it's happening. It's just a matter of whether it's happening for you and how. Now, if you don't want to do any of those things, what's happening is startups. This is a company that we work with in Pittsburgh. Startups who are doing a very specific thing. So this is a company that's working on a technical application for sleep. So they're doing a very specific thing. They have very specific data that they use to do this very specific thing. We had a guy in the group just before you who has a drone company that goes up and inspects wind turbines. Very specific stuff. So artificial intelligence can be used in specific ways. It doesn't have to be like the whole organization wide. Although I will tell you that that's the trend. What the consulting firms are saying this year is that the larger corporations will be completely AI integrated within the next 2 years. That the whole organization. Remember when in this morning's session when you heard about, from the moment there's a telephone call from the beginning, or the moment somebody goes on and messes with your site, even for a moment, all the way through 5 years after purchase when warranty wears out. Like there's work that's happening in the back ends of your companies, and that all of that in those big organizations will be integrated with AI. But we've got this little dilemma that's going on and a lot of conversation about in the industry right now. And I'm just going to say there's 2 ways that up to this point organizations have approached attacking AI. And again, this is across all organizations. This is not we're too small. There is no too small. This is how this works now, right? So there's two ways. One is moonshot, okay? So a huge example of moonshot is MD Anderson in 2013. They actually called it the Moonshot Mission, and they decided to develop mechanism for using AI to figure out the best treatments for cancer patients, to use all the data that they had about all the patients historically and try to figure that out using artificial intelligence. In 2017, it was declared a failure, and they had spent $62 billion. So there's been a lot of discussion about, is the all-in sort of moonshot approach the way to do that? And there's also a lot of chatter in the industry about criticism, actually, about IBM Watson particularly, but all of them, raising expectations that it could do more than it could do, right? And so organizations commit. And what you're hearing a lot of, people are saying, my board is squawking at me about this, or senior management wants us to do something in AI. Why aren't we doing? You know, there's a lot of that kind of squawking because there's been a lot of sort of elevated expectation. The reality is those projects are not doing as well. Some of them are now bearing fruit. Again, it's early days. Some of them are still are bearing fruit. But the ones who are more successful actually are taking what we call the real world approach. Rather than setting your sight on the whole organization, although we did have some people here in the morning whose organization, by the virtue of what kind of organization it was, a digitally based organization, needs to have AI embedded from the beginning. But for the rest of us, going through this step of sort of real world, what needs to happen. So understanding the tech, you came here today. This is the first step, right? I want you to trust me when I say that if you took 3 days of your life and you Google search kind of what there's a great book called The AI Advantage, you spend enough time just as a manager, as a leader, learning what's happening in that field. In 3 days, you would know enough. You would know enough to be able to say, aha, there's these 3 bottlenecks in my company, and in those areas, I think we should experiment with this tech or this tech. You would know that. You would be able to do it. It's knowable information, okay? So, but the first step is to understand it. The second is to find those, like cherry pick a couple of projects. You know, a little bottleneck here, something that you can't hire people for here that you need to still do. So small projects that you can then do pilots, and small enough that you can even compare technologies if you want to. Do a license. Literally use the free one, or $1,000 a year. There are ways to access Watson in a really cheap way that help you at least to know, oh, is this even possible, right? Ultimately, if there's a real efficiency or a real competitive advantage, you would pay to bring that capability inside your company. But you can experiment and find out. Now, depending on what you read in your 3 days of reading, there are definitely people that are saying, if you're not in this game in the next 2 to 3 years, you're just going to be bypassed, and your company is going to go down that other side of that curve. But there's a lot more information out there that says, for the rest of us, doing it methodically, taking one step at a time, thinking about it, and thinking about it as compared to any competitors that we might have is the right way to move forward. Okay, last thing. Anybody know what this is?
It's a mill.
It's a steel mill, right. Why did I put that up there? Anybody got any ideas why we're finishing an AI presentation with a picture of a steel mill? Go ahead. Actually, they do now. So there's the biggest steel mill in Pittsburgh, employed 14,000 people at one time, and now employs 1,400 and produces the same amount of steel. Okay, so in Western Pennsylvania, we are naturally very suspicious of technology, and we don't like the fact that we feel like it has the impact to affect our jobs. Jobs are sacred to us because we've lived through a really bad time, right, between mills and mining and all the things that have gone on. So a lot of people will say, I don't like AI because it's going to cost jobs, and particularly people who might be doing those jobs. But that's not what's happening. That's not what the literature is showing. It is true that at the very rote level, right, the person who used to get that phone call and then go to 5 different places and enter in that new information, that person's job is being automated. But what the data is telling us is that that person is being redeployed to deal with the exponential growth of volume of interactions that people are having with any company, right? So in the olden days, again, 2 years ago, maybe 3, you have a bad experience with a product, who do you tell? Maybe your next door neighbor. It's all verbal, rah, 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 you know, like, right? Now, I text it, I email that company, I have conversations 3 or 4 times with them, I'm on social media doing it. You know, there's a whole different sort of way that happens. Companies have to staff up to have the capability to respond to that, right? And if we're all based on customer experience and we're trying to deal with that experience as it goes across the continuum, then it's not about consolidating jobs. It's about we need to get those people to stop doing things that a computer can do because we actually need them to engage with human beings, right? This is the eventual, you know, will a chatbot do that? Maybe for some things, but it's not going to replace for the volume that we need. Go ahead.
What kind of jobs are those creating? That's the thing. Manufacturing has the greatest multiplier of any industry sector. I mean, you talk about a living wage.
Yep.
Versus someone sitting in customer service taking complaints, you know.
Absolutely. Now, there's 2 things happening, and I'm going to talk about the 2 things separately. One of the things that we know for sure, just again, this is because we do a lot of trends work, that middle tier of jobs is literally gone right now, right? So we have college-educated jobs that are paying way up here, and we have jobs that do not require a college education that are paying minimum wage or a little bit above. We're trying to get it to $15, right? That middle tier is, compared to what it was here historically, non-existent, right, as manufacturing left. But what we're seeing with this work, and I'm going to take you back to this, is that this one. No, this one. What happened here was that massive numbers of people, 35,000 men between the ages of 25 and 64, lost their job in less than a 30-year period. This is what happened. This other side of this continuum is what happened. So the question for all of us is, how can we protect our companies from that happening? Because that's ultimately what's going to protect jobs. Not allowing companies in 20 years to go through that cycle. Because it's when companies are going down the backside of this curve that layoffs happen, right? So the answer is not to engage with technology. The answer is how to reinvent things to grow. Because if we can keep our companies growing, then companies use everybody. They don't use only people, you know, a bank. A bank uses everybody. They've got people who are entry level, they've got people who are senior managers, and kind of everybody in between. If the bank is creating new ways to engage and new products and services, the bank is collectively growing and continuing to move up the curve instead of falling down the backside. So the best protection that we have for jobs is actually to engage more with technology and help our businesses to live 30 years or 35 years because they've reinvented products along the way. But we also have to accept that if we choose not to do that, then it looks like this.
Creative destruction.
There you go. Talk about that.
Every 5 years, the Sheets organization puts itself out of business. They have a 5-year, every 5 years. The Sheets store 5 years from now will not be anything like you're seeing today.
Right.
They already have in place the plans for the new generation. Because they don't want to be put out of business by 7-Eleven or Turkey Hill or Wawa.
Right, because, but they could. What could happen is that they could say, oh, we're now the top of the food chain. We're the aristocracy.
Yep.
Do you see that the aristocracy is already on its way down? The curve has already begun to happen. So if you get to that point where you feel like you're the top of the food chain, there's a problem. And that needs to happen. How would we reinvent ourselves if we were put out of business tomorrow, right? What would we be doing differently? How can we imagine the future? And so that's what a lot of people do, like to do that. They're looking at all these trends. What's going where? What's going to happen? If people are we not going to need checkout because people are going to be doing it with their phones? Well, what does that mean? Who do we need on the back end then to make that happen? All of that thinking is what happens. So, and again, let's use Sheetz as an example. If Sheetz were resting on their laurels and was happy there being the aristocracy and they continued to go down, they'd start laying off people. Then recrimination starts. It's your fault, it's your fault, it's your, and they keep laying off people. And pretty soon all the people that they employ in all the states that they're in are gone, right? What we're trying to do is prevent that from happening to any of our businesses by reinventing and reinventing and reinventing. So nobody can say, I really don't care about AI, I really don't want to, unless you're okay with, I'm in this for 5 years. And that's okay. If you say, I'm in this for 5 years, I don't care to leave it to the next generation, then okay, then keep doing what you're doing. But otherwise, those 3 days that you need to put aside for yourself and do some reading and figure out, what's that one place in my company that I can try something and start working in that direction and see what happens. I fully believe that when you do that, you find the nugget that says, oh, and then this, and then this, and you reinvent your company for maybe the next generation. So that's it for today. Anybody have questions, comments, concerns? I'll take us to the end there. Maybe.
Privacy. Google, Facebook, LinkedIn. Can we just kind of put that all aside and say we have zero privacy anymore? With AI coming in, I mean, they know more about you.
Here's
than
what
you know about you.
That's true. They know what kind of dress I might like.
Yeah, what color?
That's true.
Where you get your shoes.
That's true.
You go to Zappos, they pop up the last 3 or 4.
All AI. But you've gone in there to do that. This has been a really interesting thing to think about. Our privacy stuff is actually ramping up pretty significantly. So I'll give you an example in our organization. So does anybody use HubSpot? Anybody familiar with HubSpot? So HubSpot is a CRM, a customer relationship management software that also has the capacity, it has had the capacity to aggregate all of your social media stuff. So I used to be able to walk into my office every morning and open my computer, and I could see who from what companies was on my website last night and what pages they looked at. And I could say to somebody in the company, oh, so-and-so at so-and-so company needs help with a project like XYZ, and give it to the right person. I used to be able to do that. Once the European privacy laws changed, HubSpot followed. I can't see any of that anymore. So there is movement in the privacy direction in the United States. Now, here's the disadvantage as it comes to AI. The big competitor for developing AI technology and even that next platform is China.
Oh, yeah.
No privacy concerns. So Alibaba is organized and owned by the government. So all of the data in China is fair game. So we're actually behind the curve from a privacy concern in that way. But yes, whatever data you choose to give out, you're giving it out. Now, hopefully what's happening is that organizations are saying, I'm going to return you value for the fact that you gave me that data. You purchased 5 black dresses, and in that process, you gave me permission to talk to you. And permission is required to do that. And now I'm just going to keep talking to you about these other 5 dresses and how do you like polka dots?
You're going to be aware of that.
But I'm going to be aware of that.
You're not going to do it behind the scenes like they've been doing.
Right, and that's the point of moving towards privacy, is that it's become correct, for good or for bad.
I think just to go on his question, like the slide you showed at the beginning, which I was just interested, was the decline in confidence in the United States government, and I wondered myself, what is the reason? Why is the decline in confidence? Is it because of and I don't know, maybe you have an opinion, but I think my question then to go to this topic is, what do you think there's a potential for the decline in confidence in artificial intelligence as well?
So there's a thing, Gartner does a hype curve and talks about for each one of sort of the things that are happening in technology, where is it on this curve? What they say about artificial intelligence is that it's the top of the hype curve right now, and all the hype about it is going to calm down as it's moving down the other side. I think that what we know for sure is that the current generation, of sort of midstream adults who happen to be millennials, have a way lower trust and confidence in governmental organizations, period. right? And actually large organizations. So there are lots of things that are happening in our society as a result of that. It's not just about government. You know, it's about institutions, right? It's about joining clubs. It's got a much broader. And where does it come from? Well, I mean, it's embedded in some of the DNA that has to do with bad things that happened when they were in middle school in our country. I mean, there's a lot of things that sort of feed into that. So September 11th being one of them, right? So that's gonna shift and change as generations change. Some generations are gonna have more confidence. They're gonna grow up in a Kennedy era, and they're gonna see moonshots, and that's just gonna happen. Our government is gonna go up and down in the same way confidence in all of our institutions is gonna go up and down. What we have to figure out is how do we behave in that in order to protect our companies, and grow them. Yes.
I don't know if I'll throw this out here. You can shorten it as much as you want. Blockchain technology and cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
Thoughts on both?
You know what? Both of them are moving to mainstream. Both of them will be part of the tech world, but it's artificial intelligence. Getting people to have this kind of conversation about artificial intelligence is one thing. Try to have the conversation about blockchain.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, so it's the next thing. I would say that when you sit down to do your 3 days, focus on this first. That will come next. So.
Is it going to happen? Those two?
I think that there are already companies that are embedding. So I think there's going to be some degree of integration. So we'll see, how that system goes. All right, I was given the warning. 4 minutes ago, I was given a 3-minute warning. So I need to let you go. But I really thank you very much for coming and talking and sharing your ideas. So 2 things when you go home. Think about the hook and find a project. Okay. Thank you.